Charles Whitman was born into privilege, a world where opportunities flowed as effortlessly as the river that ran through his family's estate. He grew up in a grand house nestled in the hills of Connecticut, where every detail of his life had been planned out long before his birth. His parents were educated, well-traveled, and deeply embedded in the high society of their community. Stay with us to see what unfolds next. As a child, Charles had been sheltered from the real world. His worldview was shaped by textbooks, high-profile dinner parties, and a family that believed their success was a reflection of their inherent superiority. His father, a businessman of considerable influence, often spoke in terms of power, status, and control, while his mother, a woman of grace and poise, upheld the values of tradition, wealth, and the careful preservation of their status. It was a world where race had little place, unless it was in the form of carefully managed servants or household staff. Charles, for the most part, never questioned this world. He never needed to. The people around him had a certain elegance, a certain way of life that was admired and often envied by others, and they were white. It wasn't that Charles was an overt racist, far from it, but he had been conditioned by the subtle, persistent prejudices that flowed through his family's bloodline. He never thought to challenge the assumptions he'd inherited. After all, it wasn't until adulthood that he truly began to see Black people as individuals, and not as categories or stereotypes, unlike the occasional cleaning staff, or the people he saw on the television news as struggling or in need of help. By the time he left for college at Harvard, Charles had mastered the art of blending in with the elite. He studied economics and business, following in his father's footsteps. He never once questioned the roles that race played in the economic systems he was studying. The Black community was distant for him. His circle was white. His friends were white. And when he did venture into neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, they were places of poverty or crime, or so he was told. He kept his thoughts to himself, believing that if he were to voice his opinions, he'd risk being seen as radical. Even so, he found comfort in the distance he kept from the realities of the world beyond his privileged life. The distance kept him safe from uncomfortable truths, from confronting the systemic oppression he was subtly benefiting from every day. But everything changed the moment he took a job with an international company that had just expanded into Africa. The decision to move to Lagos was part of his career trajectory, an opportunity to rise in the corporate world. He had heard of the thriving, chaotic city before an emerging market with opportunities too large to ignore. He imagined the city in terms of economic potential, not people or culture. But when he landed in Lagos and saw it for the first time, something shifted. It wasn't the flashy skyscrapers or the bustling streets filled with honking cars and vibrant stalls. No, it was the people, their resilience, their energy, their unwavering spirit in the face of struggles he couldn't yet comprehend. The more he observed, the more he was struck by the contradiction between the poverty he saw on the surface and the pride, joy, and tenacity that emanated from the people. There was one evening, months after he'd settled in, that changed everything. Charles was attending a corporate event at a luxurious hotel in Lagos. He hadn't planned on staying long, but something about the way the guests, Black men and women, moved through the room caught his attention. The confidence with which they spoke, the dignity they carried, and the warmth they exuded made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to seeing Black people in such a light. He had only ever seen them through the lens of what was expected of them, subjugated, oppressed, and struggling. But here in this room, these people weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were successful, strong, and proud of who they were. He felt an overwhelming sense of shame wash over him. For the first time, Charles saw the Black community not as something other, but as something powerful, something that could no longer be ignored or underestimated. It was then that he realized he didn't just want to know them, he wanted to be part of their world. But how could he reconcile the deep-seated biases he had grown up with this newfound admiration? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing: his perception of Black people had to change, and he was ready to change with it. A few weeks after that transformative evening in Lagos, Charles found himself invited to a gathering at the home of one of the prominent figures from the event, a man named Chijioke Okafor. Chijioke was a successful entrepreneur, a self-made millionaire, and someone who Charles had been introduced to during that corporate event. The invitation came as a surprise, but there was a strange pull to it, something about the warmth and openness that Chijioke and his guests had radiated during their brief interactions. The day of the visit arrived, and Charles dressed in his usual crisp, tailored suit, though this time there was a nervousness in his step. He had never visited a black family's home before, at least not one like this. He had always associated such visits with formal events or charity efforts where there was an unspoken sense of distance. This, however, felt different. He wasn't sure why, but something in the air told him that this visit might be the beginning of something far more meaningful than business or polite pleasantries. Chijioke's home was a large modern house on the outskirts of Lagos, surrounded by a sprawling garden and a high fence that gave off a sense of privacy and exclusivity. But what struck Charles the most was how the home felt alive. The sounds of children laughing, the smells of freshly prepared food wafting from the kitchen, the echoes of lively conversation. It felt like a place of warmth, community, and life. Chijioke greeted him at the door with a broad smile, his arms open in a welcoming embrace. "Charles, my brother, you made it," he said in a booming voice that resonated with genuine excitement. Charles, caught off guard by the warmth, awkwardly shook his hand and returned a smile. "Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this." As they walked into the house, Charles was immediately struck by the vibrant atmosphere. It wasn't just a house, it was a home. Family photographs adorned the walls, showcasing generations of smiles, celebrations, and togetherness. Children were running in and out of rooms, and in the kitchen, Chijioke's wife, Nikki, was preparing a meal with a few other women in the house. The energy in the air was palpable, and Charles felt a sense of awe mixed with discomfort. He had been to upscale restaurants and parties before, but this was different. There was a raw authenticity here that he hadn't expected. It was messy, imperfect, and yet filled with life, a stark contrast to the sterile, controlled environment he was accustomed to. As the evening went on, Charles found himself seated at the table, surrounded by Chijioke's extended family and friends. The conversation flowed effortlessly, with laughter ringing out and stories being shared. The guests weren't just rich in wealth, they were rich in culture, in history, and in a sense of unity that transcended anything Charles had ever experienced in his own circles. At one point, Nikki, who had been quietly observing Charles since he arrived, leaned in. "So, Charles," she said with a playful smile, "what do you think of Lagos? I know it's a lot to take in for someone who's not from here." Charles hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He was conscious of his own ignorance. "It's overwhelming, honestly," he admitted. "I've never seen a place like it before. There's so much energy, so much life." Nikki nodded knowingly. "Lagos has a way of doing that. People here have to survive. But we also celebrate life, despite everything we've been through." The words hit Charles like a tidal wave. He had always seen survival and struggle as a burden, something to overcome. But here, in this room, he realized that survival didn't mean living with resentment. It meant living with resilience, with joy, and with a deep-rooted connection to something greater than oneself. The night wore on, and Charles began to engage more with the people around him. He found himself laughing, sharing stories, and most surprisingly listening intently to the wisdom of those around him. There was an older man, Chijioke's uncle, who shared stories of their family struggles and triumphs. He spoke with pride, recounting how they had built their business from nothing, how they had fought against the odds, not just to survive, but to thrive. "What people don't understand about us," Chijioke's uncle said, "is that we are not victims. We are warriors. Our history is one of strength, not defeat." Charles was taken aback. He had always thought of black people in terms of their struggles, not as individuals with agency, with power. As the evening continued, he found himself questioning his previous assumptions. The black people in this room weren't just overcoming hardship, they were living full lives, rich with culture, pride, and dignity. By the time the evening came to a close, Charles had learned more than he had ever hoped for. He had seen a different side of black people, a side he hadn't even known existed. The people he had spent the evening with weren't just a race or a category in his mind. They were human beings with stories, with dreams, and with a depth he had never before acknowledged. As he left the house that night, Chijioke gave him a hug. "I'm glad you came, Charles. You're always welcome here," he said, his voice sincere. Charles nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Chijioke. I didn't know what to expect, but I've learned a lot tonight." The drive back to his apartment was silent, but his mind was racing. He replayed the conversations, the laughter, the food, the warmth. He realized that he had come to Lagos with preconceived notions about black people, but what he had found was something far more beautiful, something far more human. Weeks passed, but Charles couldn't shake the memory of his visit to Chijioke's house. The faces, the laughter, the resilience of the people he'd met, it all stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts like a faint melody he couldn't quite escape. He found himself going over his notes from meetings in Lagos, but his mind kept drifting back to that evening, to the way they had embraced him, despite his initial discomfort, despite everything he hadn't understood. It was like he had entered a new world, one that made him question the boundaries of his old life. The next few months saw Charles more frequently involved with Chijioke's family, both professionally and personally. It was a slow immersion into a world he was still unfamiliar with, but the connections he was building were real. Each time he visited, he felt a little more at home, a little more connected to their way of life. He began to notice the little things, how the family would come together after a long day, the way they'd support each other through the ups and downs of life. It wasn't just a house, it was a community, an ecosystem of care and commitment. One afternoon, Chijioke invited him to a family gathering at their country home in the outskirts of Lagos. Charles, now more comfortable in their presence, agreed to join. As he entered the house, he was welcomed by the warmth of the sun shining through open windows, the scent of freshly cooked food, and the sound of voices in conversation, laughter, debate, and shared memories all mixed together in a symphony of life. This time the energy felt even more familial. The children ran around, their laughter infectious, while the adults engaged in spirited conversation about politics, business, and family matters. Charles was drawn into a discussion with Nikki about the importance of education, especially for young women in the country. "You see, Charles," Nkechi explained, "we don't just want our daughters to survive this world, we want them to thrive in it. We need them to know their worth, their power. The world will tell them they're not enough, but we won't let them believe that." There was a fire in her eyes, a passion for something larger than herself, and Charles couldn't help but be moved by it. His own upbringing had been steeped in a world where education was a given, a mere expectation. But here in this home, education was seen as a form of empowerment, a tool to break free from the limitations society had placed on them. As the days wore on, Charles spent more time with Nikki. Her intelligence, her grace, and her strength were undeniable. There was something in the way she carried herself, in the way she navigated the world, that fascinated him. The more time he spent around her, the more he realized that his initial attraction to her wasn't just about physical beauty. It was the way she challenged him, made him rethink everything he thought he knew about race, about culture, about himself. He noticed that their conversations, often about societal issues, personal struggles, and cultural understanding, became deeper. Charles began to understand the layers of pain, resilience, and joy that existed within black communities. He was seeing, for the first time, the richness of black life, not defined by victimhood, but by pride and the constant fight to be seen, heard, and respected. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, the sky painted with the colors of a fading sunset, Charles found himself speaking honestly with Nikki. "You know, I used to think that black people were mostly defined by their struggles," he confessed, staring out at the view. "But being around your family, seeing how much strength and joy there is, I've been wrong. I didn't understand what it truly meant to live as a black person, to live with dignity, despite the odds. Nkechi turned to him, her expression softening. It's not just about struggle, Charles. Yes, we've faced hardships, but the world doesn't get to define us by that. We define ourselves. Charles felt a rush of realization. He was seeing them now not as a group of people trying to survive, but as individuals, each with a rich, multifaceted identity. They weren't just people who had been oppressed, they were people who had lived, loved, and built something meaningful despite oppression. They were more than the labels he had once put on them. I never understood what you meant when you said the world doesn't get to define you. But now I do, Charles said quietly, and it's inspiring. Nikki smiled, her eyes warm. I'm glad you're starting to see us, Charles. It means a lot. That night, as Charles lay in his bed, the weight of his transformation pressed down on him. He wasn't just falling in love with Nikki, he was falling in love with the culture, the history, and the resilience that she embodied. It was a love that felt more profound than anything he had ever experienced before. Over the next few months, their relationship deepened. Charles found himself spending more time with the family, understanding more about their traditions, their struggles, and their triumphs. He attended community events, joined discussions about education and politics, and began to immerse himself in the issues that mattered most to them. He wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was a participant, an advocate, and most importantly, someone who was learning what it truly meant to be human in a world filled with division. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, the sounds of the city buzzing in the background, Charles looked at Nikki, his heart full of admiration and affection. I've spent my whole life looking at the world through a lens of privilege, he said, and I'm ashamed of how narrow my vision was. But you've opened my eyes to something far bigger than I ever could have imagined. You've shown me the true meaning of strength. Nikki took his hand, her smile gentle yet full of conviction. And you've shown me that not all white people are the same. You're learning, Charles, and that's the most important thing. Charles knew then, without a doubt, that his feelings for her went far beyond infatuation. He loved her. Yes, but more than that, he loved the world she had introduced him to. It was a world of complexity, of beauty, and of truth. As months turned into years, Charles's life was no longer just about business meetings, high-profile dinners, and corporate success. His world had shifted entirely. What had started as a professional encounter in Lagos had blossomed into something far more profound. His connection with Nikki and the family she represented had transformed him. By now, he knew the weight of his own change. He no longer saw black people as the stereotypes he had been raised with. He had shed those layers of ignorance and misunderstanding. Instead, he saw them as individuals, each carrying a history of struggle and triumph, each with a dignity and strength that was unshakable. Nkechi wasn't just his partner, she was his teacher, his guide to a world he had never understood but now deeply respected. Their love wasn't just about physical attraction or shared interests. It was rooted in a deeper understanding of each other's humanity. They had spent countless hours talking about the things that mattered: family, dreams, culture, and what it meant to truly belong somewhere. Charles came to realize that love was not just about being with someone who mirrored your own life, but about embracing their world, their experiences, and their history. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their home in Lagos, Charles felt a weight in his chest, a heaviness mixed with clarity. He had fallen in love not just with Nikki, but with the entire life and culture that she represented. Nkechi, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. When I first came to Lagos, I thought I was here for business. I thought I was here to expand my career. But the truth is, I came here because I needed something. I didn't know it then, but I was searching for something that could give my life meaning beyond success and wealth. And I found it. I found it in you, in your family, in everything that you represent. You've shown me a world that I never even knew existed. Nkechi looked at him, her eyes soft with affection. I know, Charles, you've come a long way, but you've been willing to learn, to grow, and to be open to the truth. That's what matters. Charles took her hands in his heart full. I want to be a part of your world for the rest of my life. I want to honor your strength, your culture, and everything you stand for. I want to build a family with you, one that shows the world that love is not defined by the color of our skin, but by the depth of our hearts." Nikki's eyes welled up with tears, a smile breaking through as she squeezed his hands tightly. "You already have, Charles, and that's what makes this love so special." Charles had made his decision. He didn't just want to marry her because of the love they shared, but because he knew that by marrying her, he would be embracing everything she stood for: the history, the struggles, and the triumphs of an entire people. It was an acknowledgement of the humanity he had once failed to see. A few months later, Charles stood before Nikki, surrounded by friends, family, and loved ones. As he slipped a ring onto her finger, he made a vow not just to her, but to everything she represented. It was a promise to love, to understand, and to never again be blinded by prejudice or ignorance. He had come to see that Black people were not the stereotyped, simplified versions of his past. They were warriors, dreamers, survivors, and achievers. They were human beings deserving of love, respect, and equality. "I do," he said, his voice filled with emotion as he looked into her eyes. "I do, not just because I love you, but because I've learned what true love means." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause that moved Charles. It was the sense of peace that washed over him. He had made the right choice. His decision to marry Nikki wasn't just a personal choice, it was a stand against all the false narratives that society had built about Black people. He wasn't just marrying her, he was marrying into a legacy of strength, wisdom, and love that could never be reduced to a simple stereotype. As Charles and Nikki stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the future they would build, it was clear that love was the answer to breaking down barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. The truth that Charles had come to understand was that we are all human. We are all more than the stereotypes or prejudices that society tries to place on us. We are shaped by our experiences, our cultures, and our histories. And when we open our hearts and minds to others, truly see them for who they are, we can build something beautiful, something real. The story of Charles and Nikki isn't just about romantic love. It's about breaking down racial divides, challenging our assumptions, and embracing the richness of diversity. It's about understanding that Black people are not defined by their struggles, but by their strength, resilience, and humanity. Don't judge people based on the color of their skin, the community they come from, or the struggles they face. Take the time to truly get to know them. Listen, learn, and love them for who they truly are. If this story moved you, made you rethink your assumptions, and left you feeling inspired, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Like and share this story with your friends. Let's spread the message of love, understanding, and unity. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on the story. Have you ever had a moment that made you question your assumptions?